Okay, apologies for that. Anybody who joined the previous stream, we are now on this stream. I'll delete that video a little later. I see that YouTube lost my stream, so I'm hoping that everybody got onto this one instead and that the video and the sound is working okay. So I'm just waiting for confirmation of that. Um, my live stream counter says I'm live, but it said that previously. Okay, so this live stream's purpose is to discuss the excellent. Alrighty. So I guess YouTube just got its little wires crossed. So we are live. So this live stream's purpose is to discuss internal political stressors in fantasy kingdoms. Okay, so what do I mean by this? These are internal forces that lead to climactic events like coups, rebellions, revolutions, and civil war. Basically, the stressors that create the situation that leads to the kind of explosive political violence, the kind of internal tearing apart of a society. And in doing research for this topic, and in general for the whole political fantasy series that I am busy scripting and filming, the thing that struck me most is how much economics matters in this context. There are other contributing factors, and we'll talk about them first. But basically, as long as your economics kind of works, so as long as people are, um, that they're earning enough to keep their family stable, they can buy a house or they can afford their house, they can afford food, and their children aren't starving, they are unlikely to engage in massive political action that puts themselves at risk. But if people are in a poor economic state, you run a great risk of those internal stresses within a country tearing it apart. And hello to Katie and Shakal and Alura. And I'm glad you guys made it back. Apologies for the video not working in the previous one. Okay, so what are besides the economic conditions that can lead to these internal stresses, there are a couple of other internal stresses that we should talk about. One of them is ethnic and sectarian division. So this is when a country contains multiple ethnic or religious groups, and there are disparities in power distribution or in historical grievances that can lead to tensions. So you most commonly see this in empires, where you have different groups that have been brought in under the same banner, and then over time there becomes grievances between these groups. This group is being treated better than my group by the emperor, and then people grow resentful, and those tensions, those sectarian divisional tensions between ethnic groups that live under the same banner can very easily result in conflict between those groups, which, if those groups are large enough, can result even up to the level of a civil war. William Blowers says the Balkan plague. Yes, absolutely. If you're European or if you're American and you've studied European history, you'll know about this. The Balkans famously are pretty much a powder keg, and they are different ethnicities grouped together in the Balkan area. And yeah, um, they have been united under a single banner in the past, but it never ends well. It literally never ends well. Then besides ethnic and sectarian division, you can also have political repression that can lead to internal tension. Now, this one's reasonably obvious. This is when you have autocratic governance or lack of political freedom that can lead to significant stress within a country as people feel that they have no legitimate avenue for change and they then revert to violence. You can often, the country that I emigrated from, South Africa, is an example of this. In the end, we had a bloodless revolution for which I'm deeply grateful, having lived through that period. But there was an entire regime built around the political repression of one group and of non-white people, of black people, and that regime was extremely repressive. And the non-white population did, in a large part, resort to some degree of political violence, and in the end, forced a bloodless revolution because of this political repression. So you can certainly use that kind of autocratic or repressive regime to create these internal tensions. Then there is also external influences that can create internal stresses. So this is when another country interferes in internal stressors. And external powers might support rebel groups, or they could actually ignite the conflicts, or they could prop up a small government and basically support a government that doesn't have popular support, keeping them in power. And Tim says this is getting way too real. The thing is, yes, I hear you, but these are the examples we draw from. So I'm going to draw from history. I'm not going to talk about events after 1850. I only brought up the South African example because I went through it. I lived in that period. So I'm not going to talk about current day politics. There's just too much. I'd rather talk about fantasy. So we'll be talking about historical events. I feel you, Tim. I do feel you. Okay. Then you can also have internal tensions caused by loss of legitimacy. And we're going to be talking specifically about the events that followed the French Revolution when we discuss this one in detail, because this is when the ruling body is seen as corrupt, ineffective, or illegitimate, and it loses popular support. And then, of course, you can have ideological divides like you had in the run up to the English Civil War with the monarchists versus the people, the parliamentarians and their conflict. And all of these can create internal stresses. But what my research has shown me is that one internal stressor that doesn't lead to a rebellion, a revolution, or a coup. In fact, a revolution requires one hell of a run-up. Okay, people will try peaceful means. They will try rebellion. They will try every other avenue long before they get to the point of revolution. You have a myriad off-ramps before you reach a revolutionary point, because I don't think any human, or no, okay, obviously not any human, but most humans, most people look at their environment and they're like, okay, but I don't want to live through a bloody revolution. I don't want to destroy the whole society. I just want to fix it a little better. I just want it to work a little better. And that's why revolution typically is both rare and mostly gets stomped out, because successful revolutions need to draw from a very broad base. And we will get to them. But first, let's talk about the different kinds of stresses that lead to different kinds of political endgames. So the political end games typically in play with these internal stresses. Let's start with coups. So coups are carried out by entities within the state, such as the military or the elite factions, and they aim to seize control from the current government. They are so this, for example, Catherine the Great seizing control from Peter the Third, or the example we're going to talk about a little later, Napoleon Bonaparte seizing control from the French Directorate after the French Revolution. Now, coups are most likely to occur when your internal stressor is a loss of confidence in leadership among the elite and the military, combined with the capability to organize and execute a takeover. If you think of Catherine the Great's coup in Russia, the leadership had basically lost all faith in Peter the Third. They were like, this dude is a useless incompetent, right? And Catherine, his wife, offered, an alternative. And she was willing to put herself on the line. She got on a horse and led the army against Peter and arrested Peter and basically got the army behind her. And it was a quiet, bloodless coup, except for Peter himself. He didn't survive, sadly. Well, I don't know how sad it is exactly, but I guess he was unalived. But the coup itself wasn't a major bloody affair. It wasn't like half the court died or anything. People went to sleep with Peter as the Tsar and woke up with Catherine as the Tsar, pretty much, or the Tsarina. And that kind of action is mostly when the elites lose confidence in the government. So if you want to set up a situation where you have a coup plot, what you're looking for in your internal stresses is an incompetent leader, but the common people aren't yet in a state where they're getting riled up. And your point of view characters in the case of a coup is almost always your elite characters, because you are dealing with people who are replacing one leader with another without changing the structure of society. Okay, it's basically your least horrifying your least horrifying political violence, your least bloody. Then rebellions. Okay, so rebellions are more likely to occur when oppressed or marginalized groups seek to challenge their conditions but lack access to state mechanisms. Rebellions often start with grassroots support and can turn violent if peaceful means are exhausted or suppressed. Rebellions don't have to turn violent. It doesn't always have to end in violence. It can just be a protest against the government's actions, against the elites of the government. And bear in mind, a rebellion is not looking to change everything. So a rebellion would be like the Barons' Rebellion or the Peasants' Rebellion in the English history, where they forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. Or like that kind of action where you're not looking to change the government. They weren't looking to overthrow the monarchy and create a whole new type of government. They were just looking to get more representation. Okay, and this is important to understand, because a rebellion and a revolution are not the same thing. And I've seen people use the two interchangeably, and that doesn't make sense. Okay, a revolution tries to change society completely. A rebellion is looking for certain specific reforms. So if you want to set up a country with internal stresses aimed at a rebellion, what you're looking to do is have a fairly large group of people who feel that they are marginalized, like the peasants in the in Britain under the rule of King John. Or the example we'll also be talking about is the Yellow Turban Rebellion against the Han Dynasty, where the peasants felt that the Han Dynasty was oppressing them. And I mean, which of course it was, because peasants are always oppressed, but excessively oppressing them, and they were suffering economic hardships. And then there were additional tensions as a Taoist sect arose that identified themselves wearing yellow turbans, that said that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. And of course, the way the Chinese imperial setup works, if the emperor loses the mandate of heaven, it is not considered to be against heaven to rebel. In fact, it's considered to be your duty to rebel. So this is one of the great things about the mandate of heaven in the Chinese systems. You have the mandate of heaven, and you are the blessed son of the heavens until you're not. Until, for whatever reason, people are like, nope, 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 you've lost the mandate of heaven, and it is now our duty to rebel against you. So, yeah. Tim Haldane, so in Star Wars, the rebels would more accurately be described as revolutionaries. Yes, because the rebels wanted to not just replace the emperor, they wanted to change the government back to a democracy. It was a revolution, not a rebellion, despite the fact that we commonly call it a rebellion. Katie Kofimak brings up women's suffrage, which was women protesting to get the vote, where they were rebelling against the government. They did things like chain themselves to the Houses of Parliament and engage in various other forms of protest, including getting thrown into jail, to rebel against the fact that they didn't have the vote. And in the end, this resulted in reform. And that's why I say rebellion doesn't always have to be this bloody, violent thing. It can be a movement that rebels against what they perceive as injustice, and they force change. And that is also a successful rebellion. Any rebellion that forces change is a successful rebellion. Then civil wars. Okay, so this is a monstrous one. There's no way that a civil war ends pretty. Because basically it is when you have a division in a country where you have large organized group with access to resources that can sustain prolonged conflict, and there's a deep, deep, deep division in your society, creating these two sectors that eventually everything spills over and they clash. And the Civil War we're going to talk about will be the English War of the Roses, also with reference to our good friend George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, because that is a very apt descriptor of the kind of political tensions that within a country that lead to civil war. And then the last of our subjects is, in fact, revolution. Okay, so revolution is a broad-based coalition aimed at radically restructuring the society and governance. This is not like, I want a reform. Okay, this is, I want to change the government. I want to go from a monarchy to a democracy, or I want to go from a democracy to a monarchy, which is what the Roman Empire did, right? They went from a democracy under the Senate to a tyranny under Caesar, not actually through a revolution as such, but it had revolutionary effects. And revolutions are always, always, always broad church affairs. And what I mean by that is the revolutionary coalition that is put together involves disaffected elites. It involves people in the middle layer. It involves people at the lowest layers, street revolutionaries. It involves intellectuals. And the reason why is because if you think about what a revolution is setting out to do, this isn't like a rebellion where you can go, okay, the government can go, okay, I see your point, we'll have some reforms. You are literally setting out to wipe the government, which means that at the point where, which means that the government has no choice but to try and stamp out the revolution. And for the revolution to have any chance of success, it must be massive. Because it has to involve people at all walks of life in to have any chance of success. And most revolutions fail because the government has all the power on their side, and the revolution is making this ragtag kind of bid for power. Williams says, I'd argue the American Revolution went from rebellion to revolution since the founding fathers initially didn't want independence. Yes, agreed. And this is one of the important points, right? And that's why I said revolution will offer you off ramps. Okay, before you get to the point of revolution, even the Russian Revolution, people approached the Tsars. The Tsars were ruling Russia with an iron fist in serfdom without a constitution. And it's really funny because the Tsar of Russia was also the Duke of Finland at that same time. And Finland had a constitution. So he was a constitutional monarch. But Russia itself did not have a constitution. The Tsar ruled as a iron-fisted dictator of Russia. And the people approached the Tsar and they were like, you've got to let the serfs not be serfs. You've got to institute economic reforms. You've got to let Russia have a constitution. You cannot keep ruling like this. And off ramp after off ramp, the Tsars just kept bullying straight through. And basically, none of the reforms took until it went from failed rebellion, successful revolution. Revolution is a process. It's a process and it has off ramps. And if you miss enough off ramps and you have an idiot in charge, you'll end up with a revolution. But it is almost always preventable if you can catch just one of those off ramps and give people the reforms that they want. Okay, so we've discussed each of those. So let's quickly talk about some examples. So the coup of 18 Brumaire, probably abused that name, something fierce. My French is terrible. Anyway, it was in 1799 and it was in France. So this was post the French Revolution. Now, I have previously spoken about this in a video, but just to recap, after a revolution, you almost inevitably have instability. And this is simply because you've put together this broad church of disaffected elites and peasants and middle and merchants and intellectuals and all these people, right? And they have like a simple slogan that keeps them all together, like liberty, equality, and brotherhood, which was the French Revolution slogan. And then they win. But liberty, equality, and freedom means different things to different people in this coalition. So to the elite, it means that they give other people a little bit more rights, but they're still in charge, right? To the peasants, it means that they get to charge more for their bread, right? They're going to get more money for their wheat. To the townspeople, to the burghers of the town, it means so they're going to get more bread for less money, right? And all of these ideas are actually conflicting, and they've just been held together by the revolution. And now the revolution has succeeded. And so it gradually begins to fall apart. It's the nature of this kind of broad church that you have to put together for the revolution to succeed. So after the French Revolution, there was an immense period of instability. So the French Revolution had created instability because it swept away the previous government. And no matter how bad that government was, they were stable. And having swept them away, there was all this disagreement. The alliance fell apart. You had the reign of terror. So there was a great deal of instability. And this instability was not helped by the external forces, because, of course, all of the kings of Europe were like, but we don't want that revolution infecting our people. Like, we quite like being kings, thank you very much. So they put a lot of pressure on France and sent a lot of agitators into France to kind of break up those revolutionary alliances and ensure its instability, and kind of try to get France back into, being a kingdom like sensible people, because they didn't want no democracies sitting on their borders. Okay. So, and then of course, there was massive economic hardship because of the revolution, and because the other countries of Europe closed their borders to France and wouldn't trade with them and so on. So they had massive instabilities, they had dramatic economic problems. And along came Napoleon Bonaparte, and he rose in the military ranks. And he used the military to enact a coup, and he replaced the French directorate with the consulate, with himself as consul, basically taking on the Roman style of title of consul. And he had prestige, he had control over the military, the country was in a dire state, and so people supported him in this coup because they were tired of the chaos of the post-revolution government. And yeah, of course, he led to the external conflict and lots of other things. But so that is an example of how a previous political event, like a revolution, can create internal stresses within a country as it grapples to deal with, okay, we won the revolution. Now what? Because it doesn't all go the way of, like, even the Russian Revolution, there was a civil war afterwards because the revolutionary coalition falls apart. But that kind of conflict can go on for years, where you've had a massive political event and then it just keeps going. Then the rebellion we're going to talk about is actually quite a funny one, because I think it's kind of a funny one. As funny as, look, obviously none of these things are really funny. Like, it's horrible, people die during it. But there are historical, factoids that are kind of cute about them. Okay, so the rebellion we're going to talk about is the Pugachev Rebellion, 1773 to 1775 in Russia. And this was a peasant uprising led by Emilyan Pugachev, who claimed he was the Tsar Peter III, and in other words, the husband that Catherine had unalived. And he led the peasants in rebellion against her, against Catherine the Great. And it was basically, the internal stresses there were serfdom. Again, that serfdom thing was what ended the Tsars of Russia. They just could not let serfdom go. Long after the rest of Europe had all made peace with the fact that they couldn't do serfdom, the Tsars kept pushing serfdom. And serfdom is a horrifying institution, because basically you tie people to the land. They're not allowed to move from the land. It's like a herd of cows. You're like, this herd of cows comes with the land. I mean, it's terrible. Anyway, so serfdom, and then Pugachev, he claimed to be Peter III, and this, of course, garnered quite a lot of support from those who were still loyal to Peter III and didn't necessarily want Catherine the Great on the throne. I mean, she was, after all, a German princess, not actually a Russian one, despite the fact that she spoke the language fluently. Um, and yeah, pretenders is a really funny phenomena. And in a magic situation, in a fantasy situation, there is so much potential in like somebody going, no, I am actually such and such a person, and leading a rebellion against, the monarch on the principle of like, I am this person that they actually unalived like 2 million years, 20 years ago, or whatever the case is. So you can do quite a lot with that in a fantasy world where you can back that up. But even in our world, it happened because, you know, you can just fake it. You can just lie and pretend. I mean, who's gonna gainsay you, especially before, photos and so on were a thing. And I mean, now with AI and all the rest of that, I could make a photo say anything. Um, Katie says, "Now what is a groovy place to begin any tale?" Yeah, that's for sure. We won. The rebellion was successful. The revolution was successful. We're all drinking champagne in the streets. But the next morning you wake up with a hangover and it's like, okay, but now what? Because now someone has to govern, right? Anyway, so the Pugachev rebellion was very interesting, and it had one other cause that I do want to talk about, an internal stressor cause, which was the ongoing Russian involvement in the Russo-Turkish War, which left some military resources stretched, providing a window for the rebellion. So if you have your main force of peace, your army and whatnot, you have them tied up in an external conflict, and now you have an internal uprising. That internal uprising can be really hard to put down. Now, obviously, Catherine the Great did eventually, stomp on the Pugachev rebellion, but it was a very interesting rebellion, and it is worth studying if you want to do that kind of pretender rebellion, which I think is what Martin is doing with the young Griff storyline in the books. I don't know. Has anybody read that far in the books? Do you think that young Griff storyline is anything other than a red herring? It just feels like it came out of nowhere, and it I'm not sure of the relevance. Anyway, besides the point. Um, okay, let's talk about the English Civil War and Game of Thrones. So the English Civil War was a conflict between the Roundheads and the Royalists. Okay, so the Roundheads were people with their hair more or less cut like mine, short hairs, and the Royalists were the guys who supported Charles I. Now, some of the one of the biggest stresses in the English Civil War was the ideological division between how England should be governed. Should it be an absolute monarch, or should it be bound by Parliament? And this manifested in how Charles I tried to raise money for his wars, right? Because under English law, he had to go through Parliament to raise money. But he didn't want to do that because he believed that he was a king in the line of the ancient regime, chosen by God and the dude in charge of everything. And so he and Parliament kept fighting. And then he would try to raise money without Parliament, which was against the law, and people would rebel and there'd be unhappiness. And this, just kind of escalated. But this wasn't the only ideological division. And if there's one thing that the War of the Roses teaches us, it's this: multiple stressors. The more stressors you have in a given society, the bigger the eruption of conflict. because you also had the barely papered over religious conflict in England at the time. Now, this, of course, was the outgrowth of the Protestant versus Catholic situation and the religious wars that had erupted in Europe due to this division in the Christian faith. And in England, of course, Henry VIII had split off from the Pope and created his own church, and that was the Anglican Church. And then you had the Puritans, and then you had the actual Catholics, and of course, Charles the First. And I'm trying to remember the lineages. Anyway, Scotland had remained Catholic, and the Scottish king had become the English king, and it was a mess of religions. And so you had religious division, you had this division of royal authority versus parliaments. And then, because of the way that Charles was raising money and because of his wars, you had massive economic tensions. Everybody, from the rich to the poor, was suffering under this economic tension. And guess what happened? It erupted into massive civil war between those who supported Charles and those who supported the parliamentarians. And if you look at Game of Thrones, it is like, I dispute people who say it's exactly the same story, because it's not. But there is the same kind of personalities, and there are the same kind of political stressors that resulted in the Civil War. You have the rebellion that, started this, put a new king on the throne. There's been all kinds of like uncertainty about the monarchy. And then you have the king being accused, the king dies and his son is accused of not being legitimate. And you have this kind of internal stresses. And then on top of that, you layer economics. And oh boy, if you have a divided country and you then start suffering economically, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have an explosion in your political violence section. And then we've spoken a little bit about the American Revolution. And as William said, absolutely, it started with a rebellion. It started with, the colonies, the 13 colonies, didn't originally want to necessarily start their own government, etc., etc. They just didn't want to be taxed without representation and so on. But of course, there were already signs that, that created their own cultural identity. I mean, they were on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean from England. They were no longer Englishmen as such. And of course, you had an absolute idiot in charge of England at the time, and he pushed the matter to the point where they were like, okay, but now we're revolting, we're done. You miss off ramps and you end with revolution. Allura says there are also those who choose a side based on fear as opposed to loyalty. Yes. So they're often in any of these situations, people don't exclusively choose because they support the rebellion's ideals, or they support the revolution's ideals, or they support the government's ideals. It might be that they simply fear what happens if they support the other side, or they have too much to lose, and so they choose to support the government or the rebellion or whichever side. The last thing that I want to briefly touch on, I see I've been talking nearly 40 minutes, is the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Okay, so now, as I said, this was a revolution against the Han Dynasty of China in 184 CE. William says George had nothing to do with the refusal of the American Revolution. It was Parliament's decision. Yes, I agree, William, but George wasn't playing with a full deck of cards, if I remember my history correctly. But I mean, I speak under correction and I don't have the articles in front of me. Okay, so this Yellow Turban Rebellion and the Han dynasty, right? So the Han dynasty had economic problems. I'm telling you, if you want serious economic internal stress, economics, 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 economics. If you don't have economic stresses, it's not enough to have ideological differences. If you have sufficient economic stresses, you can almost get away with having no other stressors. Economics is the big one. It's the one that drives people into the corner. No, 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 William, you're not at all distracting me. I was just saying, I think I seem to recollect him not playing with a full deck of cards. Um, okay, so the government imposed high taxes and labor obligations on the common people. So, and this further strained the living conditions of the Chinese peasantry. And corruption among the local officials had led to uneven tax burdens, with the poor bearing the heaviest tax burdens. The government was rife with corruption. And government corruption basically erodes people's trust in society. And when people start losing trust in society, they start losing trust in each other. And that's when you really start going towards a bad place in terms of how people see the government and how they, because it becomes a case of like, but why should I obey you? You're corrupt, you know, and it's a very short step from there to rebellion or revolution. Um, then, so that's all about incompetent governance and basically the corruption within governance. Um, yeah, Katie says starving and dehydrated people being challenged. Absolutely. All right, then the Zhang brothers were two guys who were like faith healers in the Buddhist tradition. I can't really describe them any other way. They claimed to heal people. There was a plague in China. People believed that they brought healing. And so they preached equality and they promised a new era of peace and prosperity through their religious teachings, which obviously massively appealed to the dispossessed and marginalized groups within society. The movement also promised spiritual salvation and supernatural rewards, which were super attractive during these times of widespread suffering and injustice. Um, so Chang, okay, I hope I'm pronouncing that better. Um, and then, of course, the Han dynasty had started to weaken by this point. They were already being undermined by their generals, and they had started losing control of the courts. Now, the rebellion was eventually put down, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, especially after the Wan Chang brother died. But it left a lasting impact because it created an almost a stressor all by itself sitting in imperial China. And um, and eventually the Han dynasty fell shortly after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, not per se because of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, but because it weakened the state so much. And by itself, it created a political stressor. And if you want to set up political stress, don't be afraid of putting in previous political events that still have lingering after effects, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion, like the French Revolution setting up Napoleon Bonaparte's coup. You know, all of these massive events have these aftershocks. They have, if that the society hasn't stabilized. So you have an unstable society that then only needs a little bit of a push to shatter apart again and give you this immense political plot to play with. Okay, that is everything I prepared for today. Apparently, I've spoken a lot. So, William said the sad thing with the American Revolution is George had nothing to do with the refusal. It was Parliament's decision. Um, I mean, it was definitely Parliament's decision by that point because George was a parliamentarian monarch. I mean, the whole English monarchy had gone that way. So I can legitimately see that. I swear I remember something about him being a little bit nuts. But I mean, you know, I think all of the royal lines to some extent are a little bit nuts. I don't think you can engage in their kind of breeding program and not end up, you know. And plus, they live so far removed from normal people that I think that they're all perhaps a little crazy. Anyway, um, are there any other questions, thoughts, commentary? Oh, right. William says, "Oh, we went crazy twice before the revolution." Yep. Yeah, yeah. That's why I say, like, I'm sure I remember him going nuts. Like Mad King George. That's right. They called him Mad King George. Political stressors can be very interesting to play with, but you do have to maintain a certain amount of distance from the craziness these days. Um, yeah, the rebellion against Dong Zhu is oh Z. If you're still online, how do you pronounce that word? um, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Dong Zhu is also a good example of the methods I described. Yeah, a lot of the Eastern rebellions make for very interesting study. I don't know if anybody else has read the Dandelion Dynasty, which I really found interesting in terms of the things it draws from. Zhou, so it would be like Dong Zhou. Okay, thank you. Um, so it is very worth looking into Imperial China's history uh, for historical inspiration for rebellion. Like, I actually did a lot of research into the Yellow Turban Rebellion when I was putting together my kind of rebellion in Sangwheel Chronicles, because I had the same kind of, I had some religious aspects to it, but I had mostly a military situation. And I wanted to kind of leverage their, it was almost like there was the rebellion and there was the religious aspect, and the two were in sync, but they weren't happening because of each other. And that's why I ended up doing a lot of research into the Yellow Turban rebellion. So, if you're looking for some inspiration, definitely check out the Eastern the Chinese Empire and the various rebellions and the changes in ruling family and that kind of thing. And it is also very worth looking at the dark ages of Europe, the early period after the Western Roman Empire fell, like the rise of the Merovingians and the rise of the Carolingians and Charlemagne's rise and so on. That early part of European history, some fascinating political plays and stories and things that people did that came out of there. And I am planning on doing a video on the early Merovingian period, because they were they were an interesting family. They had some interesting takes on the world. And I think it's very well worth doing a political video on them. But otherwise, guys, thank you for sharing an hour of your time with me. I always do enjoy these live streams, even though they do give me nightmares from the technical perspective. Katie says, I think political tensions that don't erupt are still fascinating. Industrial revolution, changes from the status quo, and so on. Yeah, I agree. even if you don't have an actual eruption, even if you don't have kind of the end result, it is still very interesting to include that revolutionary process, or that political stressors. Um, Tim says, thank you, Tim. I am very glad that you enjoyed it, despite it feeling a little too close. Great to see you as always, Williams. And thank you, Alira. Always a pleasure to run them. And I will see you guys for another one in a month's time.